O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Colleagues, before we begin, I'd just like to ask you to join me in wishing our colleague, Minister Green, a very happy birthday. I wouldn't say how many years. And we're wishing you many more to come. Enjoy your day. Enjoy your day and questions today. Okay. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, despite the challenges brought on by COVID-19 global pandemic, the Government of the Northwest Territories has continued to roll out energy initiatives under the 2030 Energy Strategic Action Plan that will help ensure N.W.T residents, communities, businesses and industry have access to secure, affordable and sustainable energy. The Government of the Northwest Territories has made a mandate commitment to strengthen our leadership and authority on climate change, and the way we will achieve this is through the implementation of the 2030 strategy. As members of the Legislative Assembly know, the energy strategy has 6 strategic objectives to reach its 2030 vision. They include 1. Working together to find solutions, community engagement, participation and empowerment, reducing greenhouse gases emissions directly from electricity generation and diesel-powered communities by an average of 25%, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from road vehicles by 10% per capita, increasing the share of renewable energy used for space heating by 40%, increasing residential, commercial, and government building energy efficiency by 15%. And the longer-term vision is developing the N.W.T's energy potential, addressing industry emissions, and doing our part to meet national climate change objectives. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to update members today on the status of achieving these objectives. A number of community projects have been funded jointly by the territorial and federal governments under the Greenhouse Gas Grant Program to reduce the use of fuel and lower emissions. For example, the YK1 School Board received funding to install wood pellet boilers into two Yellowknife school facilities, and the town of Fort Smith was funded to make energy efficiency and electric heating upgrades in 3 town buildings. The Arctic Energy Alliance, AEA, also continued its regional office program, which operates in 6 regional offices to engage with communities, promote AEE programs, and to provide support for local energy projects. Last year, this program invested $800,000 into the work of these offices, resulting in over $1 million worth of energy rebates paid directly to communities, businesses, and residents outside Yellowknife for things like energy-efficient appliances, efficiency upgrades to buildings, alternative heating like wood stoves. This is out of a total AEA budget of about $5.9 million, of which there was a record total of $1.9 million in rebates given across the Northwest Territories last year. So over 50% of these rebates were provided to communities outside of Yellowknife. The N.W.T is advancing a project to build a 170-kilometre transmission line from the Tolson Hydro system to serve Fort Providence, Kakisa, and Dory Point. This project is essential for the N.W.T to meet its greenhouse gas reduction commitments, providing about 15% of the total reduction target for electricity generation, and would remove up to 1 million litres of diesel and 2.5 kilotons of greenhouse gas emissions annually. The project will use power from the existing Tolston system to eliminate the use of diesel for electrical generation in these communities and reduce the cost of power. Mr. Speaker, to help reduce their emissions from the transportation, the AEA launched an electrical vehicle rebate program. in June of this year, which provide rebates up to $5,000 for a new electrical vehicle and up to $500 for charging stations in hydropower communities. The N.W.T is also exploring new technologies that could help reduce transportation emissions, including liquid biofuels. The department is currently conducting a study that would not only help us understand whether liquid biofuels can work in cold northern climate, but also how factors like availability, storage, and cost affect their feasibility on normal northern climates. This study is scheduled to be completed early 2021. With the new federal funding from the Low Carbon Economy Leadership Fund, the AEA launched new and expanded programs and nearly doubled the number of rebates that it provided in 2019-2020 compared to the previous year, for an increase of 150% worth about almost $1 million. These programs provide rebates to Northerners who purchase energy-efficient products such as wood stoves, LED light bulbs, Energy Star certified appliances. They also provide rebates to communities that install renewable energy systems and support community energy plan implementation, and made it possible to run a program to help lower-income homeowners and energy-efficient upgrades. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T continues to lead by example in energy conservation and efficiency by upgrading our own facilities through the Capital Asset Retrofit Fund. Last year, the energy efficiency projects were funded including the N.W.T Hospital, Engik School in Politak, and 4 of the schools in Hay River. Last year, these and other initiatives under the Capital Asset Retrofit Fund reduced greenhouse gas emissions by almost 15,000 tons and saved the N.W.T almost $4 million. As part of the government's long-term vision for our territory's energy systems, the N.W.T is currently upgrading both its hydro system at Snare Forks. A total overhaul of the generating unit was undertaken. Although delayed by COVID, the work is scheduled to be completed before the end of 2020. The Tolson overhaul was delayed by COVID, but the facility underwent its annual maintenance shutdown last summer. During the shutdown, equipment assessments were completed to firm up design, manufacturing, and procurement details for the major overhauls. Parts are scheduled to arrive in 2020, with the overhaul scheduled for 2022. Mr. Speaker, these are just some of the initiatives that demonstrate our government's ongoing efforts in conjunction with the Government of Canada, Indigenous and community governments, the AEA, the Northwest Territories Power Corporation, to ensure residents, businesses, and industries have access to secure and affordable energy as we transition to a strong, healthy economy that is less dependent on fossil fuels. The N.W.T's annual Energy Initiatives report, which will be released this fall, provides a full view of last year's energy initiatives. Queen Aini, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to making its programs, services and functions accessible to people in as many ways as possible. We are committed to keeping up with the worldwide shift towards online portals to access information and services of all kinds. Our goal is that to the greatest extent possible, people should be able to access Government of the Northwest Territories programs and services how they want, where they want, and when they want. The e-services team within the Department of Finance is close to a major milestone that will support our work towards this goal of greater accessibility. The launch of the new Northwest Territories e-services portal. This new portal will allow people and businesses to access programs and services online from one safe, reliable location. It is worth noting over the past 6 months, the importance of online services has only been further highlighted as our residents have adapted to working remotely and socially distancing. The goal of the portal is to provide users with secure and convenient online access to N.W.T programs and services through a single account. Once it is launched by the end of 2020, residents will be able to use it to register for and renew their health care cards, request birth, death, and marriage certificates, Existing driver and motor vehicle services, existing My EC&E services, and an improved online application for Northwest Territories fishing licenses will also be accessible all through the new portal. This initial bundle of services is just the start of our efforts to bring more programs and services online. And we plan to add a second bundle of services to the portal in early 2021. Additional ongoing releases will continue to be prioritized, planned, and launched moving forward. Mr. Speaker, we all know that the demand for online programs and services is high. As Minister of Finance, I am committed to making sure that our department works across government to ensure that we are doing our best to meet the needs of people and businesses by bringing the right programs and services online through the portal. Further, as we are committed to protecting the security and privacy of our users' data. As we speak, the e-services team is conducting thorough privacy and security assessments of the portal, all integrated back-end systems, and each service being connected. As I stated earlier, it is important that we provide our people and businesses with access to programs and services how they want, where they want, and when they want. And so, let me be clear about another aspect of this improvement. The new e-services portal creates an additional way to access the N.W.T's programs and services. It does not take away or diminish the other access points to government services. And so for clarity, this means that a resident can choose to access a program or service online or can continue to access that program or service how they always have, on the phone, in person, or through other access points. This milestone shows how we will execute our commitment as a government to providing the best possible service and constantly exploring innovative and creative ways to improve that service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of our priorities for this government is to increase the number and variety of culturally respectful, community-based mental health and addictions programs, including aftercare for our residents. Mr. Speaker, while we do have some programming available to our residents, I think there is a disconnect from what we're currently doing to what our people actually need and are asking for. For example, we have specialized treatment facilities that residents can be sent to out of the territory, which is an option for those who need this treatment. We also currently have some Indigenous groups providing on-the-land programs. However, there needs to be a gateway program that allows more people to seek help. Mr. Speaker, often it is difficult for people with addictions to navigate this system to access out-of-territories addiction treatment. For on the land, some can't just jump up and leave out on the land for 1 to 2 weeks because they may suffer from withdrawals or other physical and mental health conditions when going through withdrawals. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, our current programs don't allow for some of our residents a safe gateway to enter into some of our longer-term programs. As a result, our people in need continue to suffer. We need gateway programs like the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Program in Inuvik, in the Beaufort Delta, in all of the regional areas throughout the Northwest Territories. We need N.W.T to sit down with our communities and Indigenous groups to deal with and come up with options to deal with gaps in services that I've mentioned. We need the N.W.T addiction counselors to have outreach offices to engage and to get to know the residents who currently reside in the shelters and for those who are struggling with their addictions. Because going into a facility is not always the right answer for everyone. This current system is not one Indigenous people trust and therefore don't access assistance. We must do better to build a relationship between our mental health and addiction counselors and our residents who need it the most. We have to change the way we do things, as it's obvious it hasn't been working the way the service is being provided now. Mr. Speaker, status quo is no longer acceptable when we are losing our family members. Our family members are becoming victims and hostages to the drugs and alcohol in our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Lakes. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week I spoke about addictions and the need for additional support to combat the disease. My statement today will focus on the drug trade and drug enforcement in the N.W.T. We often hear that drug dealers are well known in the community and that nothing is being done to round them up or lock them up. We hear all too often that the RCMP and government are not doing their part to curb drugs entering the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, when we reflect on the impact illegal drugs have on individuals and families, it is easy to understand the frustration of our residents. We have a justice system that more often places restraints on those officers enforcing the law to curb distribution, sale, or use than it does on the drug dealers. There is a substantial difference between someone possessing for personal use and possessing with the intent to distribute or sell. To prove someone guilty is not a simple task. It requires a substantial number of investigative hours by police and many more by others as it winds through the court system, and then there is no guarantee of a successful conviction. Mr. Speaker, the criminal justice system is complex and the players are many. Players include the police, defendants, crown prosecutors, lawyers, judges, correctional officers, parole officers, victims, complainants, witnesses, informants, and others. One can see how information can be overlooked in a matter thrown out of court because of a technicality. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we find ourselves fighting a battle, and a battle that we appear to be losing. Our opponent is well-funded, well-organized, adapts quickly to change, and when we remove one piece, it is quickly replaced by another. If this government expects to lessen the impact of drug trade in the N.W.T, it must be a collaborative and interdepartmental approach with additional federal support. The million-dollar question is, do we have sufficient resources in the N.W.T and in each community to deal with not only drug enforcement, but the many issues that show up daily on the desk of an RCMP officer? As drugs kill off our residents, many question why our justice system appears to be failing the same people it's meant to protect. Mr. Speaker, although this is a complex matter, it remains our responsibility to ensure that we not allow another person in the N.W.T to die because of the illicit drug trade. I'll have questions for the Minister of Justice at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe the Department of Lands is the single most important department in the GNWT. Now, I think many would laugh at that. I think perhaps even the Department of Lands might laugh at that, Mr. Speaker. But whether it be land claims, on-the-land healing, agricultural land, municipal control of land, land tenure so people can get mortgages or insurance, our own residents' spiritual connection to the land, increasing mineral exploration on withdrawn land, or habitat protection for caribou, land lies at the heart of many of our solutions. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Lands presently has a broken mandate. They do not have control over many of these items, and EIA is busy at the negotiating table such that they are not given the proper attention. Mr. Speaker, this is a call to our Cabinet to make a comprehensive strategy for how we approach land in this territory, and in many cases, how we give that land back. Mr. Speaker, recently, the N.W.T First Nation got a cease and desist letter for trying to build a mini-putt and RV course on a parcel of withdrawn land. Parcel of withdrawn land that in all likelihood will be given back to them once they settle a land claim the size of New Brunswick. Now, Mr. Speaker, I recognize there's competing interests between the Métis and the N.W.T First Nation, and I don't wish to weigh in on that. I recognize the complexity of resolving these issues in the N.W.T, and many times it can be hard to figure out who even comes to the table, let alone who we give the land back to. Yet, Mr. Speaker, trying to separate the issue of building an RV park and settling one of the largest land claims in Canadian history needs to be done. These are clear and distinct issues. The Department of Lands needs to create a process for transferring land to Indigenous governments outside of the comprehensive land claim process. We are doing this for municipalities. I believe we need to do it for Indigenous governments. Mr. Speaker, we need to once and for all settle the land tenure issue. Many residents simply cannot own their home or own the land it is on and get access to insurance and mortgages in this territory. I believe we need to set out a process such that Indigenous residents can own land in fee simple. Mr. Speaker, this is one of the main issues for the Housing Corp. It is one of the main issues for municipalities. Now, Mr. Speaker, land use planning in this territory is a Gordian knot. However, Alexander broke the Gordian knot by taking a sword to it. And Mr. Speaker, I encourage the Minister of Lands to come up with a comprehensive land strategy and break that Gordian knot. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Friday I took double the time that I was allowed, so today I'm going to keep my statement very short and sweet. I just wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank all of the teachers in the Northwest Territories for the hard work that they have done in trying to get our students back to work. As the daughter of educators, I watched my mother spend countless hours working well beyond her 8-hour day in order to prepare lesson plans, as well as to mark tests, and our entire basement, as I just recently cleaned out, was full of teaching supplies. So I know how hard teachers work, and I know their dedication, and I can't even imagine trying to move it all virtually or to do all of the adjustments they've had to do. So I wanted to take today to give a shout out to the teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of systemic racism existing within government institutions and agencies is not something new. This has been a known fact for decades. However, it's something that has not always been taken seriously by most people in positions of power. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the tide is starting to turn because more and more people are beginning to speak more openly against systemic racism. Not only have we seen several months of global protests against police brutality and racial inequality, but we're also seeing key politicians begin to acknowledge and address systemic racism. For example, in June 2020, Prime Minister Trudeau said, "Systemic racism is an issue right across the country, in all our institutions, including in our police forces, including in the RCMP." That's what systemic racism is. Moreover, the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde just said this past weekend, there is systemic racism, there's systemic discrimination, let's deal with it. Let's put an action plan in place so that this no longer persists in 2020 and beyond, because we're all in it together. Mr. Speaker, despite the public appetite and the near unanimous calls by First Nation leaders of governments to address this issue, we here in the N.W.T. do not seem to be getting the message. Our government is not immune to the realities of systemic racism. For example, over the last year since becoming MLA, I've been dealing with several constituency issues pertaining to the systemic racism, specifically within the Fort Smith Correctional Complex of the Department of Justice of the Government of the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, the problem I'm referring to is to do with Indigenous employees with corrections not having sufficient protections in the air to air certain grievances about management. The current system in place is simply inadequate, so substantive changes must be made by this government on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I would seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? If there are no nays, you may conclude your statement.
Mr. Speaker, the status quo cannot persist on this matter. Otherwise, systemic racism will continue to persist throughout corrections and carry on straight up the chain of command. Change must come from the top down on this very important issue. Otherwise, Indigenous correctional staff will continue to lose their jobs if they speak out against racism or discriminatory policies that they see taking place. If nothing is done on this issue, if it continues to be ignored by this government, then our government is signaling that what the Department of Justice is doing is okay, and that systemic racism is allowed to continue unchecked and without accountability. I will have questions for the Minister of Justice later today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I voted against the carbon tax in the last Assembly because Cabinet would not require any public reporting or transparency. On December 10th, 2019, the Minister of Finance said the following about the guidelines being developed for large emitter carbon tax grants. Quote, I can assure the member that indeed draft guidelines will be shared with committees for review. End of quote. Those guidelines are specified in Section 6.6 brackets 5 of the Petroleum Products and Carbon Tax Regulations were shared with committee in March just as the pandemic hit. MLAs were also given an opportunity to comment on an approach for carbon tax reporting. While I recognize that COVID-19 has delayed a lot of our work together, there was no review of the large emitter grant program or policy under our current carbon pricing regime, and it's not clear if the program has even been used. These guidelines are now on the departmental website after I asked about them in September. I've reviewed them and can summarize as follows. The carbon tax paid by large emitters, basically the diamond mines and Norman Wells production facility, are expected to amount to about $4.1 million for 2020-21, with about $530,000 available for the grant program. This money stays in individual accounts for each emitter for up to 5 years before it is forfeited to the government. Projects can be pre-approved for a grant to cover up to the amount held in the individual accounts, with costs recoverable as long as there's money in the account. Equipment replacement, alternative energy, and fuel consumption reductions are all eligible expenses, but must account for at least a 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to a project baseline as calculated by an independent engineer. This looks like a high bar for any large emitter to get over, and the costs of an engineering assessment don't appear to be eligible. The narrow eligibility requirements also work against smaller projects or innovation that could emerge from experimental or novel technology, including renewable diesel. Given the low amount of funding that is available, the narrow criteria for approval, I'll be surprised to learn if any large emitters have actually submitted applications. I'll have questions later today for the Minister of Finance on the implementation of the carbon tax, working with committees, and how we can better encourage greenhouse gas reductions in the movement to a green economy. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member for Tuna-Day-Whittleday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on September 3rd, 2020, the N.W.T announced their intention to create a brand new department called the COVID-19 Secretariat. In all honesty, right from the start, I remained skeptical of the purpose and efficacy of this proposed Secretariat. For starters, Mr. Speaker, since this initial announcement, there have been minimal updates as to the status of the Secretariat. I feel like the Department of Health and Social Services could do better, and in my opinion, they've dropped the ball in terms of updating the N.W.T regarding the new cases of COVID-19 in a timely manner, and putting the whole N.W.T at risk. Mr. Speaker, small communities remain most at risk against this pandemic, and many people are traveling to and from Yellowknife for medical visits, shopping, etc. And without up-to-date information, we could seriously be putting these communities at risk. And example would be like DKFN, LKDFN. They have their own COVID response, and they have to be waiting on our government to respond. And again, that's something that we should look at, and I think it's an issue. And Mr. Speaker, at this time, in terms of COVID, funds are being appropriated, or what the Premier wants to put towards the Secretariat are absolutely being wasted. You know, fancy bar graphs once in a while is not effective and not worth already inflated deficit. On that note, something I really I don't think any of us in this House have really heard is fiscal restraint. It's not been part of this governance vernacular. I think we need to do that. We need to really, should come across whenever we do our business here. We are at 1.8 billion in debt and counting. And you know, we in the North, since time immemorial, have always made the most with the resources we had. And right from Tobacha all the way up to Haktak. That's how we've always done it. You know, we've always made the most of what we have, and I think that's an example that this government could follow. And with that, once you show Mr. Speaker, I'll have some questions for the Minister of Health at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Member for Sabat, Tunade Walde, sorry. Member statements, member for Kamloops.
Mr. Speaker, this week, Parsons, the main construction manager for the Giant Mine remediation, is hosting an online industry week. This is an opportunity for local contractors to learn about the project's upcoming multi-million-dollar contract opportunities. For half a century, over 7 million ounces of gold was extracted from the Giant Mine, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of tons of arsenic contamination and a $1 billion cleanup, making it one of the largest Canadian environmental remediation projects. While this project is being overseen by the federal government, the N.W.T is still a co-proponent, it is still in our backyard, and it still carries with it high expectations for N.W.T benefit retention. Last year, the Giant Mine Oversight Board reported employees were 44% Northern and 19% Indigenous, while suppliers were 56% Northern and 28% Indigenous. Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that Northern, according to the federal government, means any of the 3 territories, and it is unclear if Indigenous means local to the N.W.T, so I cannot identify if this brings significant benefit to the N.W.T. In addition, hours worked are reported rather than types or numbers of jobs held by Northerners, and fails to satisfy concerns that Northerners and Indigenous people are in lower wage entry-level positions. Entry-level positions that support rather than do remediation don't build remediation leaders for a remediation economy. Successful procurement is more than contracts being awarded to N.W.T businesses. This work, more importantly, needs to equate to trades and professional employment for residents, as well as training and apprenticeships for N.W.T workers. With a declining GDP, mine slowdowns and closures, and a shrinking skilled labour force, this project is imperative to the future of the N.W.T economy. Mr. Speaker, N.W.T residents are vocal about socioeconomic importance of this project. In response, the federal government released a socioeconomic strategy and established multi-agency committees with a mandate to better coordinate socioeconomic and capacity-building opportunities. I appreciate the federal government and Parsons for their intent to create Northern benefit, but I'm concerned about the intent becoming reality. Parsons mandates that tenders foster Northern employment, training and apprenticeships, and the federal government uses their procurement strategy for Aboriginal Business Initiative to increase federal contracting opportunities for Indigenous businesses, also finding businesses that don't meet their Aboriginal opportunity commitments. But how many contractors are fined under this initiative, and how do these fines benefit the N.W.T, given the N.W.T suffers missed procurement opportunities, not Ottawa? Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we only get one shot at N.W.T benefit retention from Giant Mine remediation. We cannot afford to fail. We need jobs, we need apprenticeships, and we need to grow into a territory capable of leading its own remediation economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Kamloops. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Oh, sorry. Member statements. Member for Lahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mary Louise Sanguas was born on September 6, 1930 in Horton River near Fort Providence. She was the only child born to Baptiste and Adeline Sabern. As well, she had a brother. She married James Sanguas when she was 18 years old and had her first child at 16. She had 15 children, 29 grandchildren, 35 great-grandchildren, and 5 great-great-grandchildren. She liked to tan moose hides, make slippers, mitts, gloves, moccasins, mucklucks. Her mother taught her at a young age how to work on moose hides, and she passed that knowledge on to her daughters. No matter the weather, there was learning to be done. Her daughter Lucy took her traveling to Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario for family events like weddings and the swearing of her granddaughter as an RCMP member. About 45 years ago, Mary Louise and her daughter traveled to numerous places across Canada to showcase her work. Pictures of her work can be found in the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa, Royal York Hotel in Toronto, YELLOWKNIFE Heritage Museum, and the Museum in Whitehorse. When she moved to long-term care, she didn't want to stay in her room all the time. She liked to be in the thick of things, as she would say. She was used to noise and she liked to be the middle of action. She wanted to see people coming and going and visit other residents. She passed away on March 22nd, 2020, 40 years and 1 day since her husband James passed on March 23rd, 1980. She's preceded by her parents, her husband, half-brother, her son Morris, and 2 daughters, Florence and Virginia. The family would like to thank the Fort Simpson Long-Term Care staff for their looking after mother during this time. The family would like to share the quote with us. Your mother is the greatest mother in the world for you. She'll be sadly missed.
Thank you. Member for Nahende, our thoughts and prayers are with the family. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. I'd like to welcome all those that are joining us in the gallery today. It's always good to have an audience. Pardon? Polly? Sorry. Minister for Member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to welcome Ms. Tracy Akalaya, who is the constituent assistant for Satu. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Satu. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I look at the community of Hay River and consider our population, our proximity to the border, and the limited number of RCMP stationed there, it concerns me in that we are understaffed when it comes to dealing with illicit drugs. Can the Minister of Justice confirm the number of funded RCMP positions and support staff in Hay River and around the N.W.T? And how is it determined that this is the number we require to provide effective policing in the N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Hay River South, Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Northwest Territories, there are 225 RCMP positions and 42 public servants who serve the N.W.T. as part of the Territorial Police Service Agreement and First Nations Policing Agreement. In addition, there are 13 federal policing positions, and specifically in Hay River, there are 16 regular members, including 12 constables who you'd see out on patrol, and 3 public servants. And this includes 2 additional members who were included in the 18-19 budget. And to the member's point about the resources in Hay River, I know that over the past few years, there have been staffing issues, and it's been tough to get that detachment staffed up. But I know those have been taken care of, and I believe they're at full capacity, and they have been for the last couple of years, which is good news. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the drug trade in the territories, you seem to hear more about it lately. We have more youth dying because of it. And what I'd like to ask the Minister is if he can confirm if the direction this government is taking to combat the drug trade in the N.W.T. is working, or is the department reevaluating their approach to the way they deal with the drug trade? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of combating the drug trade, despite what the perceptions might be, it's my opinion that the RCMP, the Department of Justice, this is the last line of defense. The first line of defense is preventative measures. It's ensuring kids have something to do in the evening so they don't go out and get into trouble. It's ensuring that there's a type of supports that kids and adults need in terms of counseling, having easy access to those things. But the member's question is about what we're doing for enforcement. So I do have some information. Enforcement is not just the RCMP. There needs to be a multi-sectoral approach. And of course, the Department of Justice and the RCMP have been working with health and education and NGOs over the years on things such as the Opioid Task Force, which included the department and the subject matters in the RCMP, who've been working closely to ensure that we don't see the type of opioid crisis here that we've been seeing in the South. There's also collaboration on the alcohol strategy. We've all seen the significant number of drug seizures over the past number of years. I mean, every time I look on the news, there's a photograph with a pile of drugs, a pile of money, and guns, and we see those on a regular basis. In addition to those large seizures, the RCMP are also focusing on enhancing the frontline officers' ability to target drug trafficking at a community level through collaboration, training, and development. And we don't hear a lot of the things that the RCMP do as well. I know that speaking with the RCMP in Hay River, they have partners, or they work closely with the RCMP in Alberta, and they stop drugs before they get into the territory, and we don't see that. We don't hear a lot of the things they do. They're not self-promoters in a lot of ways, and maybe that's so that people don't figure out their tactics, but I'm always happy when I speak with them and I find out that they're doing things that I never knew were happening. There's also the development of a gun and gang strategy that the N.W.T is embarking on with support from the federal government. So there's a number of things that we're doing. That being said, this is the last line of defense, and we really need to work on the first line of defense. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister of Justice confirm the annual costs specifically associated with drug enforcement? This would include a breakdown of RCMP, courts, and correction costs, knowing that there's probably a education component, health component, and all that, but I'm just those three I'm asking about. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Hay River South, Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can't provide a breakout. Drug enforcement is so intertwined with everything that the justice system does, whether it's an RCMP, doing a drug seizure, whether it's the courts hearing a case, or whether it's someone in the prison system. It's not possible without a significant amount of time and effort to really parse that. But I will go back to the department and see if we can get some more precise information, understanding that it would be impossible really to get the exact numbers that we're looking for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess what I would like to see on that is a cost between what it costs for enforcement versus education. So I guess it would be the last line of defense versus the cost for the first line of defense. But the last question I have is, can the Minister tell me how much emphasis is placed on education and addiction support in the battle to reduce access to drug dependency in the N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, that's a big question. Education is part of it, and addiction support, I assume, would include everything from being able to call a counselor to being sent away for counseling and aftercare. So I can give a little bit of information about what's happening. So in the schools, in grades 7 to 9, there's a program typically offered called the 4th R, and it's a skill-focused and relationship-based program, and each grade level includes a unit on substance abuse and addictions and related behaviors, and that makes up a good chunk of the program. The high school level, there's the Healthy Relationships Program Plus, which includes a unit on the impact of substance use and abuse. There's counseling supports in schools, whether through the child and youth care counselors, itinerant traveling mental health team, school-based counselors, community counseling program, and so on. And I'll speak a little bit about the education done by the Department of Health. The Department of Health has the DOPE Experience, which is a campaign focused on cannabis, which was developed in consultation with Northerners, Northern youth, and Northern youth supporters. There's a public awareness campaign about opioids. There's the My Voice, My Choice campaign for youth wellness, and there's the N.W.T Helpline Facebook page. So there's a lot of effort being put into this. That being said, there's a lot of things out there. When I've spoken to students in school, there's so many things that they need to get through in the curriculum that this is one of them. And I think sometimes it's in one ear, out the other. So there's no easy fix. I mean, I've listed off a ton of things that are happening, but this is something that takes collaboration, not just with the governments and organizations, but every individual as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, my first question is, does the Minister acknowledge that there is an issue of systemic racism faced by Indigenous staff within the Correctional Division of the Department of Justice? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier in the member statement, she referenced comments by the Prime Minister about systemic racism, by the AFN National Chief about systemic racism, and she could have referenced the MLA for Hay River North's comments at the Black Lives Matter rally in Hay River recently. Because in every Western institution, there's systemic racism. There's no getting around it, and anyone who disagrees, I think, is willfully blind. So that said, it's how we deal with it. And the North, I think we do a better job than other places, but these are systems that were created in a colonial culture, and systemic racism exists, and we have to deal with it, and we have to use the advantages we have in the territory and the people we have in the territory to ensure that it doesn't creep into our systems, and then when it is there, that we can get it out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, addressing systemic racism must start somewhere. Can the Minister explain what the terms of reference are for the recent workplace assessment, which is being completed by an independent contractor, and explain what the expected outcomes are? Also, would the systemic racism issues in the files that were presented by my constituents be addressed by this assessment? If not, how is the Minister going to address these issues? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I apologize, I'll talk slower for the interpreters. I know I've been racing through things. So the workplace assessment is being undertaken by a third party, Cross Corrections. And what that is trying to do, or what the goal of that is to tease out the issues that employees feel they're facing, determine how the workplace relationships, roles, responsibilities, and the operations of the corrections services can be improved. And from that, from the data that's collected there, I'm going to make sure that we look at that data with an eye to systemic racism and what could be symptoms of systemic racism. I know there's a number of questions in that single question, so I'll try to answer all of them. The member has brought constituent issues to me, and I believe that some of those constituents might be participating in this assessment, and if they are, I hope they bring those cases forward. And as I stated, I'm going to make sure that we look for systemic racism. Again, if I don't have an intimate knowledge of this assessment and the questions being asked, but perhaps those might not exactly target systemic racism the way that we would like them to. So I'm going to make sure that we try and tease those out if we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister sent me some emails which were puzzling regarding the individual files and my concerns of systemic racism at the Fort Smith Correctional Complex. Bureaucratic answers given to me by the Minister when this is such a hot and pressing issue for my constituents who are Indigenous staff is not acceptable. Will the Minister be more thoughtful, considerate, and give more compassionate solutions to systemic racism within the corrections system? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member is correct. She received bureaucratic responses from me, which are not common. Those are the ones that are usually sent back, but when they're answers to HR issues, I'm going to send a bureaucratic response. I don't want to get into the specifics of HR issues. That's not a minister's role. That being said, there are times when HR issues can indicate a larger pattern, and that's when we do have to pay attention. And so I have read every document that the member has shared with me from her constituents, and I am using that to help inform my understanding of the justice system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, the Indigenous staff at the Fort Smith Correctional Complex deserve justice. Systemic racism at this facility is unacceptable and must be corrected. I'm wondering if the Minister will take the high road, do the correct thing, and acknowledge systemic racism. My question is, will the Minister consider doing an external review of the Fort Smith Correctional Complex? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabatra. Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Right now, we have a workplace assessment that's happening, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. And frankly, if the results of that warrant some additional investigation, then I'm happy to pursue that as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Social Services related to her statement in the House on October 15th, where I quote, "The reason it's in the South is because people can get in right away." How long does it take from the time one accesses help and wants treatment to arriving at a treatment facility? Because from what I've seen and what I've heard, it's not such an easy process to navigate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the answer to this question really depends on a number of variables. The person who wants to go into treatment starts by discussing that possibility with their doctor, nurse practitioner, counselor, or a health professional of that kind. They then take a look at what needs to be in place to access the facilities. There's a new assessment now for COVID that has to be completed. There's questions around whether a medical detox will be required. So there are some variables there that need to be worked out. Then the person applies to the facility and gets an answer about how long the waiting time will be. So the Poundmaker Lodge waiting time now is 10 days to 2 weeks. Aventa, which is the facility specifically for women, is between 4 and 6 weeks. Edgewood in BC is between 6 and 12 weeks. And Fresh Start in Calgary, which is specific for men, is between 8 and 12 weeks. And it's worth noting that because we have contracts with these facilities, our clients are prioritized for admission. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that. My next question is based on her statements that same day where she said, "I just want to be very clear where we're focusing on a department on aftercare and things like on-the-land healing and what supports we can put in place to help people hang on to their sobriety when they come back." Well, aftercare, yes, we've all agreed here that that's extremely important, but how is the department looking at ways it engages with residents in need of culturally respectful community treatment, like our priority says, in other ways within the local N.W.T Mental Health and Addictions Department? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the Department of Health has done is really had the Indigenous organizations take the lead on the land treatment by having a pot of money for them to apply for in order to provide programming where they want to and in what form they want to. This is a fund that's easy to apply for and which has few restrictions on the way that money is spent. In terms of other kinds of aftercare, such as AA, that doesn't exist in every community. Some communities don't feel there's enough confidentiality to offer AA. There are apps for the phone. There are client surveys every 2 years, which look at how the treatment programs and aftercare programs have assisted or not assisted the residents. So we are taking a multifaceted approach, knowing that it isn't a one-size-fits-all proposition. Thank you.
Minister, oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking to the Minister to commit to see if she can look at more of an outreach type drug and addiction counselor, for example, setting up space in our shelters to aid with building the trust and relationship and better be able to assist them navigate the process if choosing help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, I can commit to that approach. It's a common sense approach to meet people where they're at, where they congregate, and to talk to them there about what kind of supports they need or referrals. I know that often in the shelters, medical practitioners do visit, counselors do visit, or people can have appointments at medical facilities. So this is something we're very interested in doing, is meeting clients where they're at in order to provide them with the services they need. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Nivik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for, I look forward to seeing that in my community. Will the N.W.T also commit to changing the way mental health and addiction service is done? I know we have the mental health and counselors, addiction counselors within the N.W.T, but the way that they work within the system with each region will be different, and I understand that. But what would a culturally respectful community drug and alcohol program look like, including elders in traditional spaces, with the counselors that we have currently within the N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nivik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that question. This is an area in which I need to take a little time to think about how this might be applicable. We have the child and youth care counselors and the community counseling program, and I think they operate within offices. They don't go out to on-the-land camps or other types of settings. So the question is, how would we make that work better? I think it's a really good question, and I look forward to working with the member to figure out how that can be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Finance, who's responsible for the N.W.T carbon tax. Earlier today, I discussed some of the shortcomings of the large emitter carbon tax grant program. Can the Minister confirm whether there was any public engagement and work with Standing Committee to develop the large emitter carbon tax grant program? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there hasn't been a formal engagement process since the time that the regime was proposed back in the 18th Assembly. However, the Standing Committee of Government Operations has been consulted both at the time of the 18th Assembly as well as here early in 2020, as I think the MLA did earlier reference. They were given a copy in advance of the large emitter grant policy back in March. And as well, similarly, the industry itself, the large emitters themselves who'd be subject to this, were also given an opportunity for some feedback on this, which came after the committee's opportunity to review. And then there was some, I believe, adjustments to some of those documents and templates after that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I can assure the Minister there was very little consultation with committee in terms of developing the actual bill that was brought forward, and that was one of the reasons why I voted against it in the last Assembly. The Minister promised that there would be some consultation on the development of these guidelines, and I'm not convinced that really happened. But on to my question, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell us whether there have been any applications under the large emitter carbon tax grant program or policy, and if so, how many have been successful? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the accounts for this program were only set up as of March 31st of 2020, which obviously falls and coincides quite a bit with what's happening with COVID-19. So as of this point, with a few months in, no, there have not been any applications yet to date.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that, and I'm kind of not surprised, given the high bar that the current guidelines put on applicants. But can the Minister tell us what the available revenues are projected for the 2021 fiscal year for large emitter carbon tax grant program? Merci, Mr. Speaker. And I did give the Minister a heads up before coming in the House today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I do happen to have those numbers now right in front of me. For the fiscal year of 2020-21, we are projecting $25 million in carbon tax revenues, which, based on that projection and assuming no drawdowns, at the end of this fiscal, the large emitter individual accounts would be estimated to be just over $2 million. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Crime Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for those figures. Earlier today, I outlined some of the limitations with the large emitter carbon tax grant program and policy. These include the narrow scope of the eligibility criteria that do not encourage innovation or experimentation, requirement for a third-party engineering assessment, lack of public reporting of any projects submitted or approved. There's no forms, Mr. Speaker, for submission of projects and more. Would the Minister agree that it is already time to review the large emitter carbon tax grant program and policy, and how will she ensure this time that there's some level of accountability and public engagement while working with Standing Committee? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, fortunately, this is a policy-based item, so there certainly is opportunity to refine it as it has now rolled out, and before any applications come in. Again, it's fairly early in its stages, and I'd certainly acknowledge that, I know the member mentions the need for innovation, the desire for innovation. I've actually heard the same from industry, that they also want the opportunity to innovate. They want the opportunity to access these funds to be real leaders in this area. So to the extent that that can be considered, I think that's a great opportunity. And again, the policy itself is not complex, it's not lengthy, and it may very easily be subject to the opportunity to fix it and to move forward with it in a way that is really meaningful, and that will address these issues that are coming forward now at this early stage. So it's the right time to be looking at it. It's the right time to be having that engagement. And Mr. Speaker, I'm quite certain that indeed, as I've said, industry has already been in contact around this. Now the member is also speaking to it. I'm quite certain that we'll be able to find a way forward that is accountable and innovative. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier I spoke about a number of issues I believe the Department of Lands is facing. In general, I think the theme was that we have a lot of work giving land back, whether it be Indigenous governments, residents, companies, or municipalities. My first question for the Minister of Lands is, can I get an update on the mandate commitment to have a process guide for transferring land to municipalities by winter 2021? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I did have the opportunity to meet with a number of the Yellowknife MLAs and talked about it. So we have a draft process that we're working on. We've shared it with the City of Yellowknife, but we're now finalizing it, and we will hope to have it within this session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do believe that was a mandate commitment that was well ahead of schedule, so I congratulate the Minister on that.
It's a Christmas present.
But Mr. Speaker, the process guide is really the first step. It is how and when we will transfer the land that matters. So what I am looking for, in order to stop asking this question of the Minister repeatedly, is can I get a firm date when we expect the land transfer to the City of Yellowknife to be completed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Land is very much committed to transfer vacant land to the City of Yellowknife or any municipality that wishes it. Unfortunately, I cannot give a firm date because it depends on a number of things. The City of Yellowknife, our Indigenous governments, as we try to work forward. So it is about working together, and if we need to, we will address small parcels of lands or projects moving forward right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do believe that if we can't get a firm date based on the process guide, then some more work needs to be done. Mr. Speaker, I recognize that one of the solutions with land transfer is to break it down into smaller parcels. I'm glad to hear the minister say that. I spoke today in my statement about N.W.T First Nation trying to build an RV park on interim land that requires one of the largest land claims in Canada to be settled before they can build an RV park. Mr. Speaker, I believe there's a disconnect between these problems. Is the minister willing to create a similar process for transferring land to Indigenous governments outside of the formal land claim process? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the department is able to transfer land to Indigenous governments, much like it does to any applicants for public land. When the Indigenous government is interested and is acquiring the land, their cooperation or business arm of the organization needs to submit their lease application moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That answer almost had everything, and then he said lease application. What I'm looking for is a process guide to transfer land in fee simple. Is the minister willing to do that? I'm sick of leases. I want to transfer and provide some certainty to our Indigenous governments, to our municipalities. Is the minister willing to create a process document for land in fee simple or Aboriginal title, whatever it may be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the member's probably going to not like my answer. No. We are working with the municipalities and we're working with Indigenous governments. We need to work through a consultation process. And I just spent the last 2 hours with Indigenous government actually talking about this process. And so we are working with everybody to try to resolve this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement today, I alluded to some differences in definitions between the federal government and the N.W.T and how they refer to Northern or Indigenous procurement within, Northern or Indigenous content within their procurement guidelines. And so I want to kind of get away from that a little bit because assumptions can be concerning when it comes to procurement, and I want to have a very good understanding of how the N.W.T is benefiting from the giant mine remediation project. So what I'm wondering from the Minister of ENR today, Mr. Speaker, is how many contracts have been awarded to N.W.T businesses both as suppliers and contractors, and what dollar value percentage of the entire value of the contracts does this represent? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I answer the questions, I want to clarify that although N.W.T is a co-component of the giant mine remediation project, the Government of Canada is ultimately the project authority when it comes to procurement. The percentage of contracts for the giant mine reclamation project for Parsons in 2018-19 was 91%. 79% of that was Northern Indigenous suppliers, and 12% went to Northern non-Indigenous suppliers. This, the 1920 saw 83% of this amount given out. 81 was to Northern Indigenous suppliers, and 22 of that was to Northern non-Indigenous. In regards to the dollar value, in 2018-19, there was $26 million out of the $28.8 million that went to Northern and non-Indigenous suppliers. In 2019-20, saw $45.85 million for a total out of the total of $49 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I go on to my next question, I'd like to request that those numbers be provided in writing and also the definitions used for each of those as well, pretty please. Thank you. My second question, Mr. Speaker, is a significant focus of the giant mine remediation project needs to be training and apprenticeship. This is an opportunity for the Northwest Territories to develop Made in the North experienced remediation workers for a future remediation economy. How many apprentices are currently working on the giant mine remediation project? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for ENR.
Thank you. In regards to Prentice, I don't know the exact numbers. Right now, we know it's 62% of on-site employees report themselves as N.W.T resident. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The numbers given today are very different than what's being reported in the annual report from the Giant Mine Oversight Board, and so I'd love to be able to figure out with the Minister where the discrepancies are coming from and better understand if it's a difference in definitions used or if there is something else happening. But my next question, Mr. Speaker, is companies that do not follow their contract responsibilities under the federal Aboriginal Opportunity Considerations are fined by the federal government. And given that the repercussions of that and the damages of that are felt by the Northwest Territories and not by Ottawa, what is the process for those fines? Do the fines go to Ottawa or any amount of the fines left behind here in the Northwest Territories? And is there any NWT benefit to those fines? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for ENR.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's contract deductions are brought back to the communities most impacted by Giant Mine via contribution agreements. In 2019-20, the federal government provided approximately $957,000 in funding to positions within the Yellowknife Dene First Nations, North Slave Métis Alliance, City of Yellowknife, and Alternatives North. In addition, approximately $450,000 has been provided to Yellowknife Dene, Deshinta, Now Ho Environmental Monitoring Training Program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question was in regards to specifically the fines received by the federal government for contracts that don't fulfill what they call their Aboriginal criteria for their federal procurement process. So it's outside of other contracts that the government provides for remediation or for partnerships with Indigenous governments. So this is very specific to people not following what they say they're going to do with the procurement contracts that they have with the federal government. And so maybe I can request that in writing. I can do that tomorrow in a written question for the Minister. But my next question is, one of the recommendations of the Giant Mine Oversight Board was for the federal government to appoint a special envoy to develop and implement a comprehensive and integrated economic strategy for the Giant Mine remediation project. This role, or this position, would act as a liaison between the federal, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous agencies. What I'd like to know is, has this been done with the federal government, if the Minister knows that, and if the federal government has not done this, because this is so important to the Northwest Territories, would the GNWT be willing to appoint a GNW staff member to do this work? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for ENR.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The project team met with Giant Mine Oversight Board in August to discuss the specific recommendations and to clarify the intent of the special envoy. GMOB clarified that they would like to see focused attention on solutions to help remove federal procurement barriers within the federal government. The project team committed to bringing this forward to senior management in Ottawa on a broader scale. It should be noted that through the project's socio-economic working group and senior advisory body, the project team already works closely with Yellowknife Dene First Nations, North Slave Métis Alliance, Cleacho Government, City of Yellowknife, Alternatives North, and Parsons to address social-economic aspects of this project. I'd also like to note that Parsons and the project team will be hosting a 3-day online Industry Day event, October 20th to 22nd. The member talked about in her member statement. The intent of the Industrial Day is to provide local contractors in the community with advanced information on upcoming work and procurement opportunities at the site. More information can be found on Parsons' website. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Tuna-Day-Welde.
Mr. Speaker, and during my member statement today, I mentioned that some of our response for COVID in terms of cases and stuff. It's important that we keep our Aboriginal governments up to date, and because they each have their own populations to deal with, their own people to respond to. So this goes to those 3 presumptive cases that we have that currently that we're looking at. And my questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. And my first question is, when will the Department of Health and Social Services let the public know when these presumptive cases are for sure either positive or negative?
Thank you, Member for Tunde Welde, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. The issue here is that our rapid testing machines are not validated for positive tests because we've had so few positive tests. In fact, none since these machines were procured. So the situation is that we need to have them validated by the Alberta lab. And so there's some transportation time, and then we get into the queue in the Alberta lab, and they provide us with the results. As soon as those results are known, we will inform everyone via public health advisory, the way we did on Friday with the presumptive cases. So I can't speed it up. There are factors beyond our control, but we are as anxious as everyone else to hear whether these cases have been validated. In the meantime, we have taken the precaution of treating the presumptive cases as positive cases and responding on that basis for maximum precautions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde Welde.
Mr. Speaker, and Masi for that response from the Minister. Okay, and I understand there is an investigation as well. Has there been updates on this investigation? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Tunde Welde, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not exactly sure what kind of investigation you're asking for an update on, but I don't have any more information to share than what I just said. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde Welde.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, and yeah, I came up with some of these questions on the fly, so my apologies for that. But I guess my last question is, are we going to be expecting any more cases aside from these 3 presumptive cases, Mr. Chair?
Thank you, Member for Tunde Welde, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have no way of knowing whether there are going to be additional cases. There was some contact tracing going on. I haven't seen the results of that. And if there are additional cases as a result of that, the public will be notified through the public health advisory process, which we used last week through the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. If a person tests positive after being in a community already, what is the government's response or protocols around contact tracing? Could the Minister please walk me through a scenario of what would happen in that instance? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. There is a protocol in the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer that a team who are trained to do contact tracing then figure out who the contacts are and then confidentially call those people and make them aware that they are a contact of somebody who has tested positive, and they give them advice on the next steps to take in the event that that has happened. Thank you.
Sir, oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister ask whether, I heard her mention that there had been training on contact tracing. Has the staff of the Department of Health and Social Services, as well as the CPHO, had formal training, certified training on contact tracing? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you. The tracing is done by the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer. I'm not sure what the member has in mind with formal training. There is a national protocol that's being followed. I don't know if that's what she means, but this is not something unique to the N.W.T. There is a formal process or a national process that is followed in contact tracing. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask then if there has been training done that the minister would supply me with the records of training for the staff of the CPHO and the HSS. In the recent cases of COVID in Yellowknife, were these protocols followed? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
I don't have an answer to the member's question. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, more of a comment. I can't believe the minister doesn't know if her own protocols were followed in a case such as this. Thank you.
Thank you. Take that as a comment. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will continue my questioning of the Minister of Lands. He refuses to create a process guide for transferring land in fee simple or Aboriginal title to Indigenous governments because presently he cannot. We have a land lease only policy in the Northwest Territories. I believe it is a cabinet policy. So my question for the Minister of Lands, is he willing to get rid of the lease only policy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Mr. Speaker, Lands has undertaken a broad review of the effectiveness of the land lease only policy in collaboration with the EIA. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate there is a review and work is being done. Will part of this review consult existing leaseholders and see whether they can transfer their land to fee simple? I believe a great example is I think we have 6 agricultural leases in the Northwest Territories. It's about 6 farmers who would be better off getting mortgages, getting loans, and running their farms if they had their land. Will such work conduct a review of leases we can convert to title? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, we need to consult with EIA, with our Indigenous governments moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not quite an answer that I'm looking for. That would be an answer that we are going to get rid of the lease-owned policy and replace it with something that allows fee simple title. Mr. Speaker, in the same vein, presently about half of Acknowledgements territory, half of the Southern Northwest Territories is withdrawn. Does the Department of Lands have any role or plan to decrease the amount of land that is presently withdrawn in interim land withdrawals? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, quick answer is no, but the member should ask the Minister responsible for EIA for that type of question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is the problem I'm trying to get to. Right now, I am not prepared to support putting a multi-billion-dollar road through Acknowledgements territory when half of it is withdrawn, the other half will likely go to Acknowledgements, and we have no guarantee what their mineral staking regime will look like. We have not provided investors certainty in this area, and I don't believe it's just EIA. I think it's EIA, ITI, MACA, and Lands, and this huge gap in land administration in the Northwest Territories. So my question is, will the Minister of Lands work with EIA to come up with a comprehensive strategy on what we are going to do with land outside of the formal land claim process? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for lands.
Voted the member, but to make him feel better, yes, we will work with the member for EIA. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
EIA next. Merci, Monsieur le Président. I would like to just ask a couple more questions, if I may, of the Minister of Finance on the large emitter carbon tax grant program. I think she almost started to make a commitment that she was prepared to review the current program and the policy that's in place. So is the Minister prepared to do that? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm hesitating only because I don't want to get mired in reviews on a program that hasn't even really barely rolled out. I agree with some of the comments the members made around ensuring that there's enough flexibility in this program to really capture true innovation, and so that we're really encouraging a sea change in terms of how we deal and how we can really use this funding to advance green opportunities and green mining. But whether it's maybe a small scale internal review that happens, that much I think is probably safe to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. She's almost there. I guess if I had had a chance to look at the guidelines and the policy, I would have given her that advice back in March, but of course everything kind of shut down with COVID. So I guess one of my concerns is that renewable diesel, and I'm not talking about biofuels, renewable diesel, as I understand, at least one of the diamond mines is very interested in trying to trial it and maybe even use some of the money that's available through the large emitter carbon tax grant program, but it doesn't make any sense to try to apply the way that it's currently formulated. So has the Minister heard about this proposal to look at renewable diesel at one of the diamond mines? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't have the details about some of the different proposals. What I do have is some engagement that's come, frankly, from my other hat, from the diamond mines who are looking for opportunities to be innovative. So, whether that's through a renewable diesel project or others, I think I take the point that there are some ideas out there that are going to be innovative where right now, if we're demanding a proof of a 5% reduction as part of the application process, that may be a difficult target to be able to provide that advanced proof of if what you're trying to do is something innovative. So, there has to be a way to modify what we're doing to ensure that we're capturing that true innovation. That has been something I've spoken about many times. Again, as I say, it may be simply a matter of an internal small R type review that needs to happen so that the eligibility criteria are not excluding otherwise valid, good projects that will advance green energy and green mining. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I mentioned this in my member statement that one of the conditions for eligibility under this grant program policy is that a large emitter is supposed to, one of the projects is supposed to reduce the annual GHG emissions by 5% relative to a project baseline, business as usual scenario. And I'm actually looking at the document, Mr. Speaker, but it's not clear to me whether that's 5% for the entire project or 5% for the specific area that an application covers. I'm not sure if the Minister can answer that question, but I'd like to ask it, and we'll see where the answer is. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the simple fact is, as I said earlier, having only been really up and running since the accounts were set up at the end of March, there hasn't even been an application yet. But I think at the very least, so as I've said already, whether it's a small R internal review or whether it's a question of putting out some guidelines to help understand the interpretation of these, of the criteria, which are admittedly short. I also have it in front of me. We do want to I think we'll have to do that to make sure that we are actually, again, capturing and targeting good projects, good ideas, so that we can actually demonstrate that this is going to be a program that encourages innovation. So, I think the member's point's been clearly made that there's some work to be done here to make this an even better program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents. Follow-up letter to oral question 239-19(2), business license for Lutso K Dene First Nation owned Frontier Fishing Lodge, and follow-up letter to oral question 274-19(2), support for residents impacted by flooding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for worker safety, compensation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, Worker Safety and Compensation Commission 2019-2020 Annual Report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. First reading of bills. Bill 11, member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that Bill 11, Legislative Assembly Officers Standardization Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. First reading of bills. Oh, sorry. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried. Bill 11 has had first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration and committee of the whole of bills and other matters. The table document 181-19(2), capital estimates 2021-2022, with member for Nevicton Lakes in the chair.
Good afternoon, members. I call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee, Mr. Norn?
Madam Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Okay. I will. Is committee agree? All right, I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report of the Committee of the Whole? Member for Nivik-Twin Lakes.
You may, Mr. Speaker. Your committee has been considering table document 181-19 capital estimates 2021-2022 and reports progress, and I move that the report of Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Member for Nahende. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion's carried. Thank you. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Tuesday, October 20th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, recognition of visitors in the gallery, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, returns to oral questions, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's address, petitions, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, motion 16-19-2, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, Bill 11, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters, table document 181-19-2, report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Tuesday, October 20th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. Order.